This is an edited version of Drakerion gameplay. It is important to note this video will not give you a strategy nor a proper tactical guide, at least on the Lokmar side. I do not have the skill nor experience. The purpose of this video is to illustrate how much thinking can be involved in this game if you so desire. One may not need to put as much thinking as I do in this video, but I hope this video shows why I consider Drakerion as chess of TCG. For those of you who are looking for high skill ceiling, this game seems to have the greater potential. Let's get started. For those of you who have never seen Drakerion's gameplay before, here is a 10,000 feet overview of how I believe two decks play. The deck I'm using, Lokmar, is built more aggro archetype playstyle in mind. However, given its starter deck, there are many cards in the deck that actually slows down aggro play, so certainly not optimized for true aggro play, but nonetheless, I believe this deck is meant to be played with attack fast, finish fast as a main strategy. My opponent's deck is opposite end of the spectrum. Kartje deck is one of the example of combo archetype that can be existing in the game of Drakerion. There are cards that gets boost as the game lasts longer than 4th turn. In particular, named character Nicholas along with Exhumation event card can consistently output 10 to 20 damages per turn as a single point of damage source. One of the things about Drakerion is that it gives so much autonomy to players that if we don't focus on our strategy or tactics, one may readily see and feel as all game plays as just simple trade of one character back and forth, especially when both players are played just for a single card value over anything else. In this game, I was hoping to play as aggro as possible, but in retrospect, after reviewing the video, it looks like I ended up playing like a control, so as a result, this became more a control versus control match. The game starts with a setup, which consists of placement of your characters that are specified on the banner. I personally call this is a character's starting formation. This changes based on your own strategy and tactics. In my case, I wanted to have max attack output value, so I placed all 3 characters in melee line, including one that has potential ranged attack capability. At the beginning of the game, each player draws 6 cards. In Drakerion, you will notice quickly that there are several pieces of the game that alleviates lack element. Mulligan is one such example. Each player is allowed to mulligan once as many cards as one likes. These cards go back to the bottom of the deck before they get shuffled, so it ensures we don't draw back the card we are putting back. There is also no hand size reduction penalty from this mulligan. Here I've decided to mulligan one card, Ravager of the Steppes, as this card is good to hold a board but does not have high damage output for early turns. At the start of each turn, each player picks a maneuver card from own maneuver pile. These are analogous to resource card in other TCGs, but each have a powerful effect and the choice have a significant tactical impact. It is important to note that this separated resource card pile is not just alleviating infamous mana screw type issue, but we have a full control which card to play. In my case, sticking with my strategy, I have decided to choose a maneuver that has direct damage output. In particular, I chose Grow in Their Suffering. Once both players have chosen the maneuver card to be unveiled this turn, we flip them simultaneously. These maneuver cards have amount of goals that we gain, number of cards can be drawn, and specific text effect. If there is a static text, it resolves immediately. This rule allows some maneuvers to interfere with opponent's resource generation. Otherwise, if each player has deployment trigger based effect, After gaining gold and drawing cards, a player with first player designation for the turn resolves their deployment effect first. At the beginning of the game, the first player is determined based on initiative value depicted on the banner. Lokmar deck that I am using have the highest initiative amongst all 5 starter decks, so I get the first player designation. The first player designation also determines who would take the first action during the action phase of the game. So my plan here is to use Grow in Their Suffering maneuver effect to deal 3 damage and discard Pernicious Vanguard, which itself comes into play using its discard ability. So as my first turn action, I can attack with it and deal additional 2 damage to total 5 damages before my opponent takes their first action. After my maneuver effect resolution, it's my opponent's maneuver resolves. You will see throughout the game, the Kartje starter deck uses recursion mechanics at its core, especially to hold a board status in early game, so they can close out combo in later turn. Especially Tireless Warrior can potentially be set up such that it recurs every turn at no cost other than committing a city. So here it seems my opponent chose to set up their discard pile as soon as possible. Following maneuver phase, we are moving on to the action phase. During this phase, each player alternate one action at a time. Since I have the first player priority, I get to act first. As planned, I use Pernicious Vanguard to finish one of my opponent's character, Death Steed Rider. The reason I targeted this is because it has intercept ability and a relatively high repulse value. Since I have declared attack as my action, this initiated combat. During the combat, each player can use combat ability or combat labeled cards. Unlike other actions, combat won't resolve until each player declares no more combat tricks to play. As a surprise combat trick, my opponent played a combat trick which reduced Pernicious Vanguard attack to 0. Since I have no combat trick to counter this, I passed and my opponent also passed. Now, combat resolves. This resulted in my Pernicious Vanguard suicide attack fail to deal any damage. As a Lokmar deck's city ability, I get to put a damage counter on it whenever my Primary Legion character gets destroyed. When 6 counters are charged, I can use them to deal 1 damage to opponent's character. In this game, 1 action based damage can be very powerful since it is non-defendable damage. Since the combat was my action, it's now my opponent's action. They chose to attack with Tireless Warrior against the 5th Shadow. Neither of us decided to play any combat trick, so the 5th Shadow took 2 damage, and its repulse was enough to destroy my opponent's Tireless Warrior. Now it's back to my action. I've decided to use the 5th Shadow ability, which allows me to discard a card and draw a card. So I can cast another Pernicious Vanguard with a hope I can finish off their damaged character this time. My opponent then played another Death Steed Rider before I can finish the first one. This was a bit problematic as it can potentially intercept my attack. I still went for it to stick with the original strategy of as much damage as possible plan. As expected, my opponent intercepted the attack with newly casted Death Steed Rider. Then my opponent decided to come after the 5th Shadow. Here I am not giving my opponent enough pressure. Ideally, I wanted it to be a situation where I am the one keep attacking and my opponent is either putting characters to keep the board occupancy, or if attacking, it is due to the necessity as they just want to get maximum value out of the character, so usually it becomes suicide attack for them. As the 5th Shadow has only 2 more life remaining, and ready to be destroyed by my opponent's next action, I have decided to attack with it, especially because its attack value is higher than repulse value, so I can get more value out by using as an attacker rather than a defender. Here we ended up training our character and gaining prestige. One way to win Drakerion is to clear opponent's board, but the other way is to win is by gaining 20 prestige. although playing as an aggro, I wasn't worried about prestige loss or victory, because if the game goes that long, I think I am losing the game anyways. My opponent continues to proactively attack. It's worth noting that number of characters on the board in this game does not translate to the who is actually winning the game. Due to alternating action system, I know I will have a chance to play another character before I lose my last one. In fact, holding off placement of new character until later in the turn and making opponent to wait some of their character's attack to less efficient target is a valid tactics. So after some pondering, at this point I've decided to attack with my last remaining character on the board. As an aggro, I really wanted to be an attacker side of the game and give my opponent pressure rather than defending side. I did not think there was a way for my opponent to finish my character even after it took a repulse damage on following my opponent's action. My opponent played a named character Mira. Besides amazing arts on the named characters, named characters in Drakerion are particularly powerful characters, whether by means of direct stats or their effect. These cards have a definitive impact on the board state. Having said that, currently no named character is so strong to the point where it simply wins the game, as in some other games. In fact, in response, I am playing my named character Galvin. Opponent, as expected, attacks Galvin with Tireless Warrior. I believe this gave 3 Tireless Warrior in my opponent's discard pile, along with Mira on the board. This is a setup allows my opponent to use Tireless Warrior recursion every turn. On my following turn, I've attacked with Galvin. It would have been an ideal move if I could have destroyed 2 characters using Galvin's reaction ability, but I did not have such setup. I believe this is where Drakerion becomes skill-based TCG. I would not be surprised top-level competitive player in this game prospectively plan all out so this particular action would result in 2 characters, 1 attack move. When one sees it as spectator of the game, they may consider it as just a random coincidence or lucky draw, but I think it's all based on the player's pre-planning. Now filled with sufficient number of skeletons in discard pile, opponents uses Tireless Warrior discard pile recursion. Knowing the opponent can bring back Tireless Warrior again next turn, I predict their next action is to commit suicide attack with the Tireless Warrior against Galvin. So prevent that, I've used You Served Me Well event card. This allowed me to discard a Prime Legion card from my hand. Fortunately, one of the cards I have in my hand can actually deal 1 damage as a discard reaction to finish off the Tireless Warrior. My opponent still had a character to cast. I did not have any action I could take, so my options were to either do a regular pass or sound the retreat. The latter will allow me to choose who gets first turn priority next turn. However, choosing sound the retreat forfeit ability to play any combat reaction. Since I still had a combat trick in my hand, I've decided to do a regular pass. So my opponent essentially got 2 consecutive actions. Unsurprisingly, they have declared to attack Galvin. At this point, I debated if I should do the sound the retreat, but I worried my opponent could have another tyrant, and if so, I thought I could use a combat trick at that point. So I ended up doing another regular pass. It turned out my opponent didn't have any more action, so they ended up doing sound the retreat and got the first player priority next turn. Obviously, this is a fun part of TCG. This is unpredictable element in the game. Sticking with aggro strategy, I've again chosen damage dealing maneuver, and so did my opponent. My opponent certainly does not want Galvin to be attacking again. This turn, my opponent got first player priority as they did sound the retreat last turn. So their maneuver deploy effect resolved first, and that finishes off Galvin. Then my maneuver finishes opponent's skeleton. Since my opponent melee line is empty, they are now forced to move all the support line characters to the front. This looks very close game. In fact, it looks as if I had the first player priority. My first action could have ended the game. Having said that, if I had the first player priority, I am certain my opponent would not have played attacking maneuver, but instead chose more defensive approach to ensure they get a time to place another character. As the first action of the turn, opponents play the third Dead Steed Rider. This is a good card to prolong the game. Its stat depict it gets better value when it defends rather than attack, and intercept ability protect important character on the board. Ideally, if I were to stick with aggro strategy, I wanted to attack with Infernal Hunter, but it already had 3 damages, and intercept ability of Dead Steed Rider will finish Infernal Hunter if I were to attack, so that was not an option. Alternatively, I was hoping a playable aggro card from hand, but other than Galvin, lacked high attack output value. Yet I did not have enough gold to pay for Galvin. So I had no choice but to switch to defensive role type of play. Evil Beauty's tutor ability with Hellhound discard reaction ability is a classic defensive intentional synergy for Lokmar starter deck. This synergy net results 9 health board placement with merely 4 goals, which is a way above rate for health. The opponent played Resurrected Champion. This is one of the main threat for Kartje deck, especially after the turn 4. The board state definitely looks like my opponent has more beatdown role than I do at this point. This isn't a good situation for me, as Kartje deck gets better as game goes beyond the 4th turn. Although I didn't quite feel comfortable that my board situation supported aggro tactics at this point, I wanted to stick with the original plan. So I declared suicidal attack with Infernal Hunter targeting Mira. My thinking process here is if opponent declares no intercept, this attack will destroy Mira and the Infernal Hunter will have another attack or riposte potential. However, I predicted my opponent will intercept. If they intercepted with Dead Steed Rider, I should be able to use Offering in the Name of Lilith as a combat trick and finish it off. If they were to use Resurrected Champion, at least it will tap the character and 1 less output damage potential. My veteran player opponent chose the best defense option and intercepted with Resurrected Champion. As their action, they use City's ability. Since they know bottom 2 cards are Tireless Warriors, this pushes those 2 back to discard pile. As a following action, they can uncommit the city using Mira's ability and then bring back Tireless Warrior. Even though it was very evident that the opponent will intercept my attack, I still wanted to not just let 3 action Tireless Warrior recursion to be so easy. So after pondering, I've decided to declare attack against Mira, which was as expected, intercepted by Dead Steed Rider. Similar to the last turn, my opponent played Tyrant. At this point, I don't have any counter against it. I think these saved up unblockable action based attack at the end of turn is really good control player tactics. At this point, I can't use my support line character to deal any damage, but I still had a charged up city to deal 1 potential damage. One option was to save it for my opponent's bringing back Tireless Warrior and use against it, especially there was no target that is currently on the board I can destroy. However, my thought process here was I predicted my opponent to use both Tyrant and Tireless Warrior to finish Hellhound. So instead, I've decided to deal damage to Resurrected Champion so I can destroy it with combat trick using Offering in the Name of Lilith when the opponent is destroying my Hellhound. Subsequently, opponent uncommitted a city using Mira's ability as predicted. I had no action available, so I passed. Then opponent brings back Terrace Warrior. Again, I did regular pass to keep my combat trick offering with Lilith available. Then they attacked with the Terrace Warrior. Again, I kept my regular pass and ready to take Tyrant attack, and as a return, surprise them and destroy Resurrected Champion along with it. But to my surprise, my opponent actually read my mind, and as a next action, they did not attack with the Tyrant. Instead, rather use the Sounder Retreat. Personally, these are one of the relatively unique moments in this game as a TCG. Analogous to a game like chess, we each try to lead several actions ahead. In this case, my opponent clearly outplayed me. If they had this whole scenario in their mind from a few actions ago when they tapped city to put 2 skeletons back into discard pile, that's pretty impressive. Upon seeing the tap, I thought they do not have a Tyrant. Then they played a Tyrant after. So this made me to believe they tricked me, and therefore they are ready to attack with Tyrants as a surprise, unavoidable attack action this turn. Therefore, I use my city ability. But instead, if the Tyrant play was also another bait, I ended up semi-wasting city action. I was really impressed here. Now the game moves into the turn 3. With my opponent having first player priority, if I do not play a maneuver card to increase number of characters on the board, I would lose the game. My opponent can play a damage dealing maneuver card to destroy Hellhound. Evil Beauty moves up to the front line, and either Resurrected Champion's attack or other 2 attack value character attack with combat trick would do it. So I chose the world is already ours. This will allow me to play another Hellhound during maneuver phase. Indeed, my opponent chose a damage dealing maneuver to finish the Hellhound. This resulted in Evil Beauty to move up to melee line. As planned, I discarded a Hellhound from my hand for maneuver's deployment ability, and paid 2 goals to cast it. Not surprisingly, rather than getting destroyed, perhaps with an action damage, my opponent decided to attack with Resurrected Champion to get the best express value at this point from the card. As my first action during this turn, I have casted Galvin for the second time in this game. After perhaps that first long thinking by opponent during this game, they have decided to use city ability. The first step for Terrace Warrior, recursion. Besides Galvin, I still felt lacking attack power, but nonetheless, I've decided to attack with Galvin to keep aggro strategy going. This was intercepted by Deathstead Rider. This was something I expected. What's unexpected was Sad Whisper's combat trick to reduce Galvin's attack. Opponent then complete second step for Terrace Warrior recursion. Although Hellhound probably serves better as a defender, sticking with aggro strategy, I went for another attack. As a combat trick, I use the name of Lilith to finish Deathstead Runner along with the Tyrant. Opponent then played Recruiter of Sleepers. As the deployment ability target, they had discarded a combo card Necros. This was a bit puzzling action, but after the game my opponent confessed they had 3 Necros in hand despite after the mulligan. I didn't have much more action left here, so I've decided to just reduce 1 life off of Mira, as she has been doing a bit too much work against me. As a surprise combat trick, my opponent gave a +1 repulse to Mira. In this game, a player can have only 1 named character with the same name on the board at the given time. So this could create a dead card in hand. But to alleviate this, Drakerion has a special rule. you can use the same named character as a combat trick card to buff some of stats. My opponent then completes recursion of Tireless Warrior for this turn. Using my last remaining gold, I've decided to play a Tormentor. Using its deployment ability and discarding You Served Me Well, I get to draw 2 cards. I was hoping this would draw something more aggro. Opponents then attack Galvin with Tireless Warrior. As I have no playable cards at this point, I decided to sound the retreat. Opponent then played Unexpected Exhumation. This is one of the combo card turn 5 and after, but here they decided to use it to destroy support line Tormentor. At the beginning of 4th turn, I have only Galvin, who's standing with merely 2 health left. Since this deck does not have maneuver card to blank opponent maneuver attack, I thought I had to cast something during maneuver phase, otherwise I'd lose the game. So I played You Can Only Join Us and use it to play Pernicious Vanguard, as that was the only playable character from top 10 cards I looked. Opponent indeed chose Assassination Order for the maneuver, and that's finished Galvin. As my first action, I ended up choosing the Evil Beauty Hellhound synergy. This certainly was a defensive move rather than an offensive one. Perhaps, if I were to truly play aggro strategy, I should have played Infernal Hunter here. Opponent then played Gathering Bones and put Dead Steed Rider back into their hand. After unnecessary amount of pondering, I chose to attack Recruiter of Sleepers with Pernicious Vanguard. Opponent then played the Dead Steed Rider that just grabbed during their last action. As my action, I used City's ability and destroyed Mira by dealing the last 1 damage. From here, I ended up continue playing very defensively, including casting another Hellhound. In hindsight, this might be a turn I have really screwed up. Perhaps I should have played Infernal Hunter at the beginning of the turn and stayed attacking. Now we get into the turn 5. The game becomes much more interesting here again, but sadly, it is not on my favor. Turn 5 is where some of the Kartje cards start seeing buffs by having full covered maneuver cards. As I see my opponent had only 2 cards in hand, I thought this may be a turn I could and perhaps need to win. So here I've decided to use Resource Destruction type maneuver. In some TCGs, the Resource Destruction may be viewed as risky design space. However, in Drakerion, I feel this has been working very well. As the first action of a turn, the opponent plays combo card Necros, a perfect play for the turn. Since there are 4 covered maneuvers at turn 5, Necros has 5/5/7 stat. Then upon deployment, it fetches Unexpected Exhumation, either from deck or discard pile. Normally a character deployment takes up an action, and it is not until the following action one can attack with it, but in this case, Necros can attack immediately. Then with a turn 5 bonus, it readies back. Oh, and with all that, it can target any opponent character and opponent cannot intercept it. At this point, my instinct was I need to get rid of Necros as soon as possible. If my opponent had an Exhumation in their hand, it can technically attack 2 more times in this turn. So even though casting Infernal Hunter at this point may make it target for Necros, I was okay trading it. In fact, by placing Infernal Hunter, I thought Necros would not be able to attack any character on my board other than 0 attack Tormentor. This is because Necros needs 5 more damage to be destroyed, and the Infernal Hunter has 4 attacks. If Necros were to attack Tormentor, I'd be perfectly fine with it, as that means the opponent essentially wasted 5 damage for 1 life character. So first, opponent attacks with Tyrant. Since I thought attacking Necros with one of my character at this point meant just letting it gain 5 riposte and the additional 5 attack, total of 10 additional damage potential this turn, I have decided to play Evil Beauty and discard Convinced Fanatic to deal 1 damage to Necros. So my opponent knows if they don't use Necros following action, I will attack with Infernal Hunter to finish it off. By the way, I actually made an error here. Evil Beauty search card from deck and not from hand. Instead of attacking with Necros, opponent played another Tyrant. Although I should have probably attacked Necros here, I've decided to use Galvan's tactics against Tyrant. In retrospect, I feel this was a suboptimal use of this card. On the following action, opponent revived Tyrus Warrior. At this point, I have finally decided to attack Necros with my Infernal Hunter, and only then to realize there was Dead Steed Rider with intercept ability on the board. It was an absolutely disastrous mistake on my part from the turns ago. At this point, I felt anything I do from my end would just make a situation worse, or perhaps my brain stopped thinking. Necros finally takes its second swing. Now, skipping nonsense actions on my part, start of turn 6 looked pretty bad for me. Here, I didn't even realize my opponent already had 17 prestige. This was my 13th game of Drakerion. During my 12 games, there was one single game that match ended with prestige, so I was not paying attention to it. When my opponent reminded me they might win the game by prestige, I already had remaining prestige that my opponent needed on the board. Skipping most of turn 6, the finish attack was done by Necros. This game certainly wasn't a way to show proper tactics or strategy of Drakerion, at least on Lokmar's side. First, I think the game demonstrated nice combo deck playstyle from my opponent. They kept early turns under control with consistent recursion, nice defensive use of Dead Steed Rider. After waiting until the turn 5, as the first action, they casted the Necros and dealt 10 damages during the turn. Adding subsequent turn damage, the Necros produced essentially 16 damage off of just 5 gold. From my end, I felt my play was a bit inconsistent. I thought I was playing aggro strategy, but watching the recording, it looked like I was playing more defensively. One excuse I make is I felt like I didn't have enough attack card. However, this is due to myself not utilizing Mulligan better at the beginning. Also, I have totally forgot that all cities has a default action to allow us cycle a card. That may or may not have saved me, but I certainly did not do all the things I could have done before blaming on the luck. I certainly tend to overthink, and my thought process is far from optimal, but I hope this video at least demonstrated how much thinking can be involved in Drakerion